It's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Adriane Dorrington. She's a senior policy analyst at the National Education Association, or the NEA. She's been integrally involved in NEA's work on racial and social justice in education. Today she'll present on, I'm hearing an echo, I guess somebody's unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. So today she'll present on bias, who me, unearthing implicit bias. Please help me welcome Dr. Dorrington.
Well, first of all, I want to begin by thanking the organizers. You folks have had a terrific, amazing day of really great, really rich presentations. So I'm sure that the participants really, really appreciate the thought and effort and the high quality that you've been sharing the entire day. I realize that I have two challenges here. Number one, I'm trying to share with you 30 years of my passion around this work. Implicit bias really dives in and connects quite closely with that of racial justice, multiculturalism, issues of racial and social justice, equity issues. So I have been spending my entire life in this area. And so the bottom line is that I am trying to take 30 plus years, put it into 55 minutes. That's number one. That's my first challenge. And my second challenge, I know I stand between you and happy hour. So those are the two challenges I'm fully aware of, and I'm going to try to balance those out. Also, I'm hoping Nicoletta, her presentation started out with technology issues, and Dottie's presentation kind of ended with technology issues. And I am really hoping, got my fingers crossed. I got my fingers crossed that that we have that the third time is a charm. That's what I'm hoping for. Now, I cannot see myself here on the camera, but I'm going to assume that people can see me, or at least see my slides. Am I correct?
Yes, we see your slides.
Okay, great. So let me begin. First of all, what I would like to do is pay homage to the Indigenous people and their land. We begin by acknowledging that we meet on traditional lands served by the Indigenous people. We honor America's first people, all elders past, present, and emerging. And I like to repeat one of their mantras. When the blood in your veins return to the sea and the earth in your bones return to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belongs to the land. And I want to thank our First Nation people who continue to be stewards of this land. And I'm going to come back to this later on in the presentation when we start to interrogate or to examine what we mean by ownership of land. As we look at and talk about and unearth and explore and examine implicit bias, if we're going to talk about changing the systems or changing other people or changing institutions, this whole journey begins with self. We have to know ourselves. We have to engage in an activity or a practice that questions what we assume to be true about ourselves. So here's where I'm going to start this presentation. I'm going to start this presentation right back at the beginning. And when I say back at the beginning, I mean back when the United States was being birthed as a nation. And most folks on this here, on watching these or engaged in this presentation right now, they're very much familiar with parts of the United States Constitution, the preamble, we the people. At the very least, they know the first three words. So if I may indulge each and every one of you, I actually would like to read this. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We, the people. But the question I want to pose to you, who are these people that the preamble was referring to? It's very important for us to have some type of understanding. Who are these people? Is it this group of people? A picture taken in the Rose Garden several years ago? Or is it this group of people? are these we the people that was referred to in the preamble? Well, let's try to keep teasing out. Who are these people? Well, again, as I went back to the beginning of the establishment of this country, I also have to acknowledge the process of slavery. So where does slavery fit in with we the people? Well, some of you folks may be quite familiar with the Dred Scott decision that the United States Supreme Court passed down in 1857. But I want to go back and kind of give you a context. It just so happens that Dred Scott was born enslaved in Virginia, and then he left with his owner and went to many different states, Virginia, Missouri, Alabama, and eventually he was moved and taken to Illinois and Wisconsin Territory. Now that's important to know, because Illinois and Wisconsin Territory, slavery was abolished in those areas. It was against the law to hold slaves. So it just so happens Dred Scott is in Wisconsin, the territory of Wisconsin, and eventually he's brought back into Missouri with his quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes here, owner. At this point, Dred Scott had married and had a child. And what he wanted to do is file a suit in the Missouri state courts, filing for his freedom. And he filed two separate suits. One suit he filed was for wrongful enslavement. And the second suit that he filed was for, because he was in a free territory, Illinois and Wisconsin, automatically, because slavery was outlawed in those states, automatically, any enslaved person that stepped foot in those territories, they were automatically free. And they could not be re-enslaved. Those were his arguments that he made to the Supreme Court. To the Supreme Court in Missouri. Now, he started this here lawsuit back in 1846. It took 11 years, having gone through the state of Missouri and eventually going up to the United States Supreme Court. This is considered to this very day to be the very worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court of the United States. And it just so happens that the Chief Justice at that time was Ronald Taney, and he was born into Southern aristocracy. So he started off writing the decision on behalf of the majority, in which, by the way, it was a 7-2 decision. He started off by saying in the decision, free or enslaved blacks had, and I'm sorry, there's a big error here, had no rights to sue in the federal courts. I am so sorry. Had no rights, and I'll correct that immediately. They had no rights to sue in the federal courts. In other words, they had no standing. Free and enslaved blacks were of an inferior order. They had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. I'm not just talking about the owner. Any white man did not have to respect the free or enslaved black. They were considered to be articles, property, which strengthened the hand of slave owners, and they could be sold whenever a profit could be made. Those were the decisions handed down by the Superior Court in 1857. So why do I want to bring this to the forefront as we talk about implicit bias? Because as we think about bias, our biases, our preferences, and so on are shaped by history. They're shaped by a whole lot of things. These particular decisions, in 1857 were integrated into the daily society of we the people. They were habitually acted upon by we the people, whether in their private pursuit or whether in matters of public concern. And yet, despite when we look back at this and we just find it amazing that this particular decision could be passed down, there was no examination. There was no reflection. There was no doubting for a moment the correctness of this opinion by we the people. Now, keep moving forward. That particular decision started to lay the foundation for this country, which is the very foundation which in 2021 that we still stand on. The resulting factors from that gave rise to biases, gave rise to norms, gave rise to practices. And what kind of practices and biases and norms did they give rise to? Well, number one, white supremacy. It said in black and white that blacks, free and enslaved, were of inferior order. It gave rise to white privilege. In other words, blacks had no rights in which the white man had to respect. It normalized the inequities because it was baked into the daily society, baked into societal systems. It also provided a foundation, gave rise to legislation that talked about the mixing of races, where racist marriage, interracial marriages were prohibited. It gave rise to issues around civil rights, gave rise to issues around voting rights, the wage gap, the economic wealth, redlining, intelligence, immigration, all of that. Think for a moment. This particular decision came down in 1857, and here we are in 2021. And a lot of these factors that were issues in 1857, we are still dealing with today. Civil rights, voting rights, the economic wealth gap, immigration. Well, as I said, when we start to look at biases, biases are these preferences that we have. And these preferences are shaped by a whole lot of things. They shape our belief systems, our beliefs, our behaviors, our practices. Our biases can be explicit or they can be implicit. If they're explicit, these are preferences I'm fully aware of. I know what I like and I don't like. I know the attributes of various people I can stand for a long period of times and other attributes and characteristics I can't stand. I know countries I like to travel to. I know types of foods I want to eat, restaurants where I want to go. Those are explicit. I'm fully aware of that. It's the implicit biases that can become very, very problematic because they work in my unconscious mind. They're part of my unconscious mind. I don't know that that's happening. I don't know that my implicit biases have triggered, have been kicked into action. Research shows us that we have over 11 million bits of information that is fed into our brains every second. And as you're even looking at the screen here, not just the information on the screen, not just the pictures on the screen, not just the colors on the screens, not just the words on the screen, but things in your kitchen area, things in your office area, looking at the plants, looking at the glass of water, maybe the glass of wine that you have beside you. There is so much information coming at you every second. But we can only consciously process 40 bits of information per second. You talk about bandwidth, 11 million bits coming in, and we can only process 40 bits. In other words, we basically operate on autopilot, 99.99% on autopilot. I showed the picture of that fountain right next door in this slide. Imagine if you're extremely thirsty and you need a drink of water. The last thing that would be happening is that you would not be able to quench your thirst by drinking from a fire hydrant. There's too much water coming at you at any one time. Just like with the information, there's so much information that's coming to us at any one time. We can't handle all that. And so what happens is that our unconscious mind will take over. This is where it houses our implicit bias. I want you to take a few moments to see how the unconscious mind works. Let's give it a tryout. Okay, you see this written on the screen. Take a few seconds and see if you can decipher this. Okay. And if I were to read that, first of all, it's like, wow, if I can read that, I cannot believe that I could actually understand what I was reading. Holy jumpers, I was able to read that. You realize that every single word is misspelled, yet the vast majority of us were able to read it without effort. We did not consciously decode the message. We were filling in gaps. Our unconscious mind was helping us to fill in the gaps. According to research at Cambridge University, this is another one. It doesn't matter what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and the last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. This is your unconscious mind working for you. So the conscious mind can take a rest, because at some point the conscious mind will have to kick into action. Okay, I'm going to ask you to, again, take a few moments and name the color of the text you see here on the screen. Name the color of the text. And if I'm looking at it from my side, I will just do the first line: red, yellow, blue, green, black. I get 5 out of 5. That's 100%. Wow, I'm good. Now, let's try this. Name the color of the text. Here, I'm hoping everyone has taken the time to try to name it. It becomes more difficult because if I read the first line again, it is blue, green, black, purple, gray. Notice that when I did it the first time on the previous slide, I went through it in a nanosecond. Notice the second time, it took me a while. Why did it take me a while? Because on the first slide, my unconscious mind was zipping right straight through that. On the second slide, my conscious mind, I am now making the conscious part of my mind work. And it takes longer for the conscious mind to process the data. As I indicated before, we all have implicit bias. We all have biases. And implicit bias matters. And we're always constantly making these associations, conscious associations and unconscious associations. Implicit bias affects our decisions, our behaviors, our interactions with others. They both can be positive and negative. They can have harmful effects when they impact our decision-making process that may be impacting other people. Understanding our own implicit bias is important because there is a connection to structural and systemic inequity. If we're going to talk about trying to ensure that we work in more equitable conditions, that we have more equity across the board, we have to understand what implicit biases that we have that either supports this drive towards equity or impedes this drive towards equity. Well, here's another challenge that we tend to have. We have what we call the perceptual lens or the lateral inference. We generate a whole lot of, self-generating beliefs. I can sit all day, read things, and I come up with a whole lot of ideas. And I adopt these ideas, I adopt these beliefs. They're based on my conclusions. They're inferred whatever I saw, whatever I read, whatever I lived through. And as a result, those particular self-generating beliefs, they then give rise to my truth. And my truth is obvious. All 350 million people residing here in the United States should be well aware of the truth, or my truth. Our beliefs are based on real data, and the data we select are the real data. See how this becomes a cycle? See how this becomes a cycle? It becomes a self-generating cycle. And so we have to be aware of, what are those self-generating beliefs? What are they? The biases shape what we see and how we react. Many a times I looked in the mirror, and what I see in the mirror is not the same thing that is looking back at me. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. We see things as we are. Well, I said, when do we start these implicit biases? How do we start to form them? Well, they usually start the very moment that a young mom finds out she's pregnant, and we start to buy baby clothes. How many of us find out that someone's having a little girl? What do? We buy pink, we buy yellow, we buy mint green with little lace. And buying boys, we buy blue. So after a while, we tend to associate pink with feminine, with females, with girls, and so on. And we tend to associate blue, maybe black, with men or males. Where did that come from? How do we learn that? This is something that we have seen in practice, we have somehow experienced, and they become part of our psyche. They become and they shape our implicit bias. They shape our biases. And also, not just the color. Look at the slogans that we sometimes have on our clothes. I'm a science teacher. I was a science teacher for many decades. And I also taught math. And one of the challenges I had so many young girls in my classroom, high school girls in my classroom, who automatically came into my classroom in September to tell me that they can't do math. They haven't even started the grade 10 year yet, but they're walking in the door telling me they can't do it. They can't do it. Why? Because there is some type of belief they have inside of them that they can't do math. Math is for boys. I'm too pretty to do math. Future trophy wife. I need a hero. Bro, do you even lift? Do we lift weights? So we start training our young people. And so by the time they become 3 and 5 and 15, 25 and 50, they've had years and years and years of being shaped around these biases and becoming part of the implicit bias residing in the unconscious part of the mind. I grew up with these novel characters, with Marvel characters. I loved my Superman and Lois Lane, all the comic books. But remember, Superman was this white guy with a cape that flew around the place. And the other thing is that with Lois Lane, she was a reporter, feisty, a very feisty person, but Superman would always come to help her. Now, notice what happened a couple years ago with our hero and heroine types of stories. Our implicit bias started to become challenged because the movie Black Panther came out, and it really challenged those implicit biases we had around who was the hero. Who was the hero? So we had Black Panther, and we had Nakia. Now, in the Black Panther Nakia, unlike that of Lois Lane and Superman, she was not being saved by Black Panther. In actual fact, she was in charge of the king's fiercest bodyguard. So she was occupying a very prominent role, and she did not need Black Panther to quote unquote save her. That challenged the whole notion of what a hero does. The men are supposed to save women, and Black Panther challenged that, those biases. I said before that our biases are shaped by a whole lot of things. History that we read, things that we see on TV, parts of social media, what people tell us, etc., etc. Here's something that was written in the paper, not so often, a couple years ago. And when you read this, what biases may be embedded in here? If we look at the picture, on the left, we see it says that Coralville police arrested 4 in burglary investigation. And there are 3 Black guys. If we look at the picture on the right, it reads, 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested. Burglary charges pending. Now, think for a moment. Think for the moment. What do you see? Some people would just read this and just move on to the next article. But what I'm trying to do is push you into interrogating what is here. What is in that unconscious mind? I'm pushing you. As we look at the diagram on the left, the picture on the left, these men don't have any status. They're African-American men, I'm going to assume, or at least men of the African diaspora. They have no status. It just says 4 arrested. It doesn't say 4 men. It doesn't say 4 wrestlers. It just says arrested 4. Look at the optics. They look like they could be quote unquote thugs. They're not poised or posed for a camera. They're like mugshots. But look at the one picture on the right. What does the picture on the right tell us? Well, the picture on the right, these particular 3 people, they are given a status. What status are they given? 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested. First of all, we know they're post-secondary. We know they're in university. And we know that they're wrestlers. So the bottom line is that sometimes when you start to read these articles, it could be either the writer's explicit biases being written into the articles or implicit bias. They're not aware of what's being read into these articles. So if we're going to start to unpack our own implicit bias, we have to be able to unpack and see these things and interrogate what is being said without being actually said. I'm sure many of you would have seen these 2 photos before. And these photos are from the Hurricane Katrina back in August 30th, 2005 in New Orleans. The first article written on Tuesday, August 30th was by the Associated Press. And the second article written was by the Agency France Press. Again, look at the terminology. And I apologize because you may not be able to see that the first photo is a young man of color. I apologize for that. But you definitely can see in the bottom photo. Look at the wording in the top. A young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store. Look at the terminology in the second one. Two residents wade through chest-deep waters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. The question I ask, if you were to read that, how many people would read that and then stop? How many people would read that and stop and say, why is one person deemed a looter and engaged in looting, and the other people are deemed to be residents finding food? The same event. These people are experiencing the same unfortunate natural disaster, but how is it written up? There are biases integrated through these articles. Optics are extremely important. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the first picture. The woman up above, a young Black woman. She is at a protest several years ago, protesting, and she's a nurse from Pennsylvania, but she was protesting down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for the killing of Alton Sterling and Philandro Castillo. And she walks up to police officers in riot gear, and she holds out her hands. She is arrested on the spot for obstruction. Does she look threatening? In the lower left-hand corner, we have Jacob Shansky, and he's from Arizona. And he was one of the men that went into Congress that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And he made it to the floor of Congress. Now look at these two people. Leisha was arrested on the spot. Jacob was arrested back in Arizona when he went back home. Who is considered to be more terrible? Both of them would have violated a law, but whose treatment was more, and at that moment in time, who received the stiffest treatment or the stiffer treatment at that moment in time? As I said before, optics are important. We had last year many police officers empathizing with the George Floyd movements across the country, given a need, a whole process that had been given rise from Colin Kaepernick. This is not a situation that many communities of color are familiar of seeing when it comes to police officers. But here we had it last year on several different occasions. But here is another picture of policing. And this was in Ferguson. This was in Ferguson, Missouri. And this is when Michael Brown was killed. And we had the militarization of the police, bringing in Army vehicles and so on. So when many Black communities or communities of color, when they think about policing, they don't think about the policing where they have taken a knee in solidarity with the cause. They still tend to see the police in the upper left-hand corner. As I said before, these optics, they either challenge your biases or they reaffirm your biases. Here we have a demonstration last year with Black Lives Matter. Again, George Floyd, a demonstration. Many people had called them terrorists. Other people call them that they're fighting for and trying to save democracy, fighting for social justice. But at the same time, we also had another group of people at the Congress. Look at these two pictures. Both of them are passionate about their cause. And then we have a sit-in last year in downtown DC. And also we had a group of people in DC in January. Now, each one of these photos, each one of them, they tell a story. And you have to interrogate the photo. What is being told? And the very first thing that we tend to do when we see pictures like this is that we use our own lens. We use our own framework of reference. We use our own perceptual lens. We use our own ladder of inference. We use our own belief system to try to understand or to interpret. And if that particular picture counters or challenges our belief system, we have one or two things to do. Either interrogate our belief system and find out where is the dissonance, the disconnect, or to ignore it and just move on and leave it. Now, I want to also move into a little bit about the health industry, factors contributing to implicit bias in health. It's not just the media. I mean, many of our institutions, many of our systems and so on, there is a lot of implicit biases built into it. It's baked into the cake. Medicine, whether we believe it or not, is an integral part of slavery. The medical colleges and the professionalization of medicine grew in the shadows of slavery. Medical colleges and the professionalization of medicine grew in the shadow of slavery. And in those days, when doctors were learning their traits or their trade or their practice, they needed to learn about the body. They needed to know what would work and what wouldn't work. And they and the enslaved people provided a supply of bodies. And it's not as if they would consent, because they had no opportunity to consent or deny. What would happen is that the owners perhaps would sell these folks to the physicians. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. James Marion Sims. He's considered to be the father of modern gynecology. And what he did, he spent 4 years in a lot of his research working on enslaved Black women. And it's thought, if you start to read any of his research papers, he perfected a lot of his surgical techniques and surgical tools by operating with anesthesia on enslaved Black women. Let me just read that again. Father of modern gynecology, Dr. Sims, perfected his techniques, devised some tools by operating with anesthesia on enslaved Black women. As I read that, and even as I read that several weeks ago when I was preparing this presentation, I could feel the chills. I could feel the shivers going down my body. I could feel it. I know what it's like to go to the dentist. And as soon as I walk into the dentist's office, I'm asking the dentist right away, give me an anesthesia, give me a needle. I don't want to feel any pain. If you're going to fill a cavity, I want to feel any pain. But many of you have undergone surgical procedures, or you have seen surgical procedures, witnessed surgical procedures. Can you imagine those procedures being done, or you haven't been a patient with anesthesia? But again, this is started to shape how Black people and enslaved people start to view medicine. The perception of medicine is also culturally based. Native Americans, when they talk about health, they're not talking about health as it relates to an absence of the disease. In many of the indigenous cultures, they talk about health as part of their environment. They're in harmony with oneself. They're in harmony with their body. They're in harmony with their mind. They're in harmony with their spirit, harmony with others, and harmony with their environment and surroundings. Native American people, as many of you may know, they do not own land, because the whole notion of land ownership is foreign in the indigenous culture. They are here to protect the land. They are here to serve as stewards for the land. And if the land is healthy, they will be healthy. If the land is not healthy and becomes toxic, they will experience that in their systems. Back last year when the vaccinations, or earlier this year when we started talking about the COVID-19 vaccinations, there was a whole lot of discussion that many African Americans and many Blacks are refusing to get the vaccinations. They're not going to get the vaccinations because Tuskegee. They're necessarily not going to get it. But what is a Tuskegee? Some of you are fully aware of this and others may not. So let me just give you a little bit of background on the Tuskegee experiment. Here was the situation whereby in 1932, the United States Public Health Services, in conjunction with Tuskegee, they had this syphilis study done. They recruited 600 African American men, and of the 600, 400 had syphilis. But what they called it at that time is that they had bad blood. They had bad blood, and they're trying to find ways to cure the blood, to fix the blood. By the mid-1940s, it became obvious that penicillin became the treatment of choice. You could use penicillin to treat syphilis. But the infected men in that study, though the doctors knew that 400 of them had syphilis, they were not treated with penicillin. That study started in 1932, and that study did not end until 1972, 40 years later, when the first report was given. And after the report was given, shortly thereafter, the study was shut down. Class action suits ensued afterwards, and the other court settlements occurred in 1974. It was 65 years later before President Clinton issued a presidential apology for all of those who were impacted by the Tuskegee experiment. It was thought by many of the medical personnel at that time that Blacks were more prone to certain defects, and that Black men were more prone, or not just Black men, but Blacks were more prone to sexually transmitted diseases. And it was thought that they were poor and ignorant and unwilling to get treatment. Those were, again, the biases. At no point, if you were to ask these 400, at no point, I'm sure these 400 would have said that they would have refused treatment. But again, biases that started to control how we engage in the healthcare industry. And those biases or those practices then informed how other people, the recipients, that being people of color, how they then responded to the healthcare industry. 20 years after the Tuskegee experiment got underway, 20 years later, Henrietta Lacks comes around. And some of you may know of Henrietta Lacks, for those in the Maryland area and those especially in the Baltimore area. Here in 1951, a young mom, 31 years old, wife with 5 kids. She entered Johns Hopkins Hospital at that time. And Johns Hopkins, it just so happens, was one of the few hospitals that would treat people of color. She came in with severe vaginal bleeding. And so she signed the necessary paperwork to be admitted into the hospital. Unbeknown to her, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and her cells were harvested without her knowledge, nor her consent. Now, the particular cells that were in her body, those cancerous cells, they were considered to be extraordinary. They had extraordinary capacity to survive and reproduce, and they are still, to this very day, are considered to be one of the most important culturable human cells. Again, today, they're still considered to be one of the most important cultural human cells. So these cells eventually were named HeLa, and the HeLa cells, the HE is from Henrietta, and the LA from Lacks. Johns Hopkins shared those cells worldwide, not just for researchers throughout the United States, but worldwide. And those cells are considered to be the workhorse when it comes to biological studies. They were key in terms of advancing a lot of the research in cancer research, vitro fertilization. These cells were used for, again, finding cures and so on, treatments for various types of infection diseases, helping to advance the knowledge in immunology. Again, these particular cells were taken from a Black woman without her consent or her knowledge and shared with the world. After she came into Johns Hopkins Hospital, because it was such an aggressive form of cervical cancer, she died shortly thereafter. Even though she died in 1951, when you imagine 60 years later, it was 60 years later before people actually knew that the HeLa cell line came from this Black woman. And Oprah did a movie on it several years ago called The Immortal Life of Henrietta, because those cells are still very much in evidence today across the world. A question I would ask as you think about implicit bias and issues of equity. Since 1951, how has Johns Hopkins been enriched by the HeLa cell line? And the other question I would ask is, how has Henrietta Lacks' family been enriched by the HeLa cell line? Again, this is part of our medical history. These are things that were talked about in Black communities. These are things that help to shape whether or not we trust the medical system. Can we trust them? And then last year, Dr. Susan Moore, she alleged that she was mistreated in Indiana Hospital. She was a medical doctor. She too was working on COVID cases, and she contacted COVID, and she was hospitalized. She knew all about COVID. She knew about the protocol, and she had asked a white male doctor who was her attending doctor, her attending physician at the time, if they could increase her opioid pain medication, and they said no. He said no. Then she went to social media, because what she started to voice in social media were what other people were saying in social media, other people of color. that Black and brown people, they felt that they were being marginalized. They were being sent home. They were not able to access ventilators. They were diagnosed with flu. There was a whole lot of information going out there how people felt they were being discriminated against, marginalized. She gave voice to some of those very concerns that people who did not have her power could not do. Now, this woman eventually, she was given increased opioid pain medication. Her attending doctor was replaced. Now, I said that she was a doctor. She didn't get her medical degree from Timbuktu. She got her medical degree from the University of Michigan Medical School. If you go back and look at some of the studies, and even if you go back and read some of the research from Dr. Sims, the father of gynecology, you know, it's thought that Black people, first of all, they're seldom prescribed the pain medication often necessary. And they're thought that they experience less pain than their white counterpart. They experience less pain than their white counterpart. Therefore, they don't need as much pain medication. And maybe that's why Dr. Sims felt it was not necessary to give them anesthesia when he was operating on them. So let me finish kind of on a high here. Here are 3 young Black men, and they're from Newark, New Jersey. And in grade 10, these 3 guys, they really didn't know each other, and they were kicked out of their respective classrooms, sent down to the office. Here are 3 young Black boys with hoodies on. When I was in the school system, they weren't wearing hoodies at that day, but they have since been wearing hoodies. And so these 3 young Black guys, as they're waiting to see the principal, they became friends. And they formed a pack. One of them had always wanted to become a doctor. The other 2, well, I don't know. But the bottom line is that they became friends. They formed a pack. And their pack was that they would ensure that they would help each other to get through school, to get through undergrad, and to get through med school. They eventually made it through their undergrad program. And eventually, they became doctors, 3 doctors. Dr. Ramek Hunt, who was an internist, Dr. Samson Davis, who's a specialist in emergency room medicine, and Dr. George Jenkins, who's a dentist. None of these guys should be doctors because for most of the time, the implicit bias is what we tend to hold true or what we tend to think is when you see these 3 young guys being kicked out of the classroom, you know they're trouble. You know that they're likely acting up. You know that they're not studying. We don't expect them to become doctors. We don't expect them to become specialists. We don't see often the potential in these young kids. With Dr. Ramek Hunt, his mother was a drug addict. He was raised by his grandma. Dr. Samson Davis, he was the 5th of 6 children. And Dr. George Jenkins, he wore braces on his teeth as a very young child. That's why he wanted to become a dentist. But they all grew up in the same project in Newark. So we need to start looking at other narratives. We need to start looking at some really good news stories. And how do we start to challenge these biases that are in the health system? I'm very much aware of the time, and I'm going to kind of go quickly through this. And I think I'm just going to go quickly through this because I know I'm coming very close to the end of my period, and I do want to share some strategies around implicit bias. I also want you to know that as I go through this work, I am extremely passionate about this topic. I'm extremely passionate about this work, but I know a lot of these issues are very sensitive issues because the moment you start talking about biases, you're talking about people's value systems. You're talking about things that I've had for decades and decades, have been shaped by my family, shaped by my friends. And so some of these conversations require courage, need to be held in very safe quarters and have courageous conversations. So I recognize that. But microaggressions and stereotypes. With stereotypes, let me go with stereotypes first. An overgeneralized belief about a person that represents a particular category. How many times do you have one person of color? He or she, whatever they do, whatever they say, it then paints the entire category. As a woman of color, many a times I was thought to be the spokesperson for all the Blacks in the area or all the Black women in the area. And people have deeply held beliefs that do not reflect reality and often are very resistant to new information. Now, with microaggressions, the difference with microaggressions is that these are verbal, nonverbal slights. Think of it like dying by 1,000 cuts, paper cuts. And whether intentional or not, they communicate hostile, sometimes derogatory comments to target people, more often than not, based upon your status. And someone has their phone on, they may want to mute it. So here we have these microaggressions here, which I'm just sharing with you. And I have to say, the bottom line is that I have been the recipient of every one of these microaggressions. You speak good English. What are they actually saying? When I look at you, I don't see color. What are they actually saying? I cannot tell you the number of times I've been followed around inside of a store. My best friend is Black. As a woman, I know what you're going through. I have heard every one of these. And I'm sure many of the folks here have heard, can add to this list. So what are the major themes and the messages coming across? Alien in your own land, you speak good English, you are an American. I remember when people came up to me, where were you educated? You speak really good English. You're so articulate. Or when I look at you, this one here really bothers me. When they say, when I look at you, I don't see color. Well, if you look at me and you don't see my color, then you don't see me. I am a Black woman. Everything that I have experienced in life has been through the lens of a Black woman. I don't know what it's like to be a white man. I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. I don't know what it's like to be a First Nation woman. I only know how I experienced my world as a Black woman. So therefore, when you say you don't see my color, you deny all my racial experience, which is me. You deny me. When customers, when store owners or clerks follow me around the store as if I'm going to steal, many times I will just turn around and walk out the door. Because there's this notion that Blacks, we have this here DNA gene of criminality. We're prone to steal, we're prone to looting, we're prone to be criminals. My best friend is Black. Denial of individual racism. I can't be racist because my best friend is Black. You know, remember before when United States that we had gone like post-racial because we had Oprah and we had President Obama. So there's no way that there could be racism in this country. We're now post-racial because two people made it. And so when they say my best friend is Black, I cannot be accused of being racist. I'm immune because I have friends of color. Or when they say, as a woman, I know what you're going through, meaning that one woman's oppression is identical to another woman's oppression. Understanding stereotypes, as I said before, is an oversimplification, usually placed upon a particular group of people. Black people are good at sports. Feminine men are gay. All Asians are smart. Spanish-speaking Hispanics are illegal. Muslims are terrorists. Immigrants bring in diseases into the country. And I'm sure you could add to this list. But I want to end off with just two more slides here, if I can indulge you a little bit longer. That when we start to think about how do we start to interrogate our own biases, and again, it's your implicit biases, not your explicit. When you start to interrogate that, there's an individual accountability and there's an organizational accountability. But the first thing you have to acknowledge is that we all carry biases. We all have implicit biases. And you have to be willing to interrogate your internal thoughts and feelings before we act instinctively, before we just go ahead and act. Because remember, implicit bias, that means you're running on autopilot. So before we run on autopilot and before we make a decision or before we do an action, why are we going to do that action? What's causing us to do that action? Interact with people who are different than you. Because as you start to travel worldwide and you start to interact with different cultures and different groups of people, you start to realize we have a whole lot of stuff in common. We tend to have more in common than we have more in common than not. And so the bottom line is that we need to be open. I know how uncomfortable I was when I went to First Nation place at the Navajo reservation. I thought I had a pretty good handle on diversity and equity and all those issues because I've been doing it for 20 plus years. But I was doing it as a woman of color. And I have to say, I've learned so much from my First Native brothers and sisters in terms of issues of equity, things that I was totally unaware of. And if I had not interacted with them, I would not have known about those particular implicit biases I had. Sometimes people, when interacting with different people, you feel uncomfortable. And when you feel uncomfortable, you need to ask yourself, why do I feel uncomfortable? What is making me feel uncomfortable? What surprises me about interacting with different groups of people? I can tell you about one of my trainings I had many, many moons ago. It was a young woman working in the government system, government services agency. She was very well educated. And when we had this here training around it was anti-racism at that time, when we had a training, she had indicated that she feels very uncomfortable being around Black men. And I remember working in her small group, and she said, I just feel like my heart is racing when Black men come around me. And I indicated to her, like, I don't understand, let's kind of tease this out. And through the course of my conversation with her, here's what I discovered. When she grew up, there was a Black community several miles up the road from where she lived. And her mother, every time that she acted up or acted out, her mother would say, I'm going to put you at the front lawn, and those Black guys will steal you and take you up to this village. They will steal you. And she said she was always terrified by being kidnapped by Black men. But she says she remembers her mother saying this to her when she was around 4 or 5 years old. This woman now would say was in her 40s. This was something that was said to her when she was 4 or 5 years old, was still impacting her 35 years later. And she was not able to make the connection about why she felt uncomfortable around Black men. Then we need to practice constructive uncertainty. With constructive uncertainty, rather than say, I'm 100% certain that this particular action is going to help our organization, is going to help me, we have to start to question that. We have to start to question our own. Why are you so certain? How is it going to impact group A? How is it going to impact group B? How is it going to impact Susie? How is it going to impact Jonna? And so on. So we have to, rather rushing to certainty, let's take our time to work to certainty. For the organization, in organizations, we have to acknowledge that inside our organizations, our managers, our staff, etc., we all have biases. And we have to start establishing policies that will encourage critical decision-making. Establish environments that will allow us to have courageous conversations, seeking input from diverse perspectives. I mean, I can at least listen to what you have. I don't have to agree to it, but I want to hear what are some of your opinions? What are some of your perspectives? And I want to know, why did you arrive at that? Because mine is so different. Mine is so different. I just understand why you came to perspective A. How do we bring voices to those who feel that they're silent inside the organization? They feel the organization don't care about them, are not listening to them, that a small group runs the organization. Consider biases that may impact the hiring and promotion of others who are different from your own group. We all like to be hanging around with more often than not with our own group, like minds. We like the same thing. But sometimes when we start to look at hiring and promotion, sometimes our implicit biases get in the way, but we're not aware that those biases are in the way. Develop a culture of inclusion or inclusivity that's built on trust and transparency and encourages courageous conversations. I have to tell you, courageous conversations are not easy. They are not easy. But if you're going to move forward, you have to go through them. And make it a practice to gather information from different sources when you're making major organizational decisions. Ask different groups of people, how is this decision? How do you think this decision will impact you? For example, even when assessing a person's job performance, is it just one person that assesses that person's job performance? Perhaps. As a manager, I only see Rochelle in a certain light. But if I ask Rochelle, some of the colleagues that Rochelle works with, maybe if I ask Rowena and I ask Java and I ask Mike and I ask Blake, maybe they can give me other input, other perspectives that helps me better understand Rochelle's job performance. So I leave you with all of that. I leave you with all that information. And again, as I said before, if we're going to move forward, if we're really going to be serious about issues around equity, if we're really going to be serious around issues of social and racial justice, if we're really serious about that, those journeys all begin with you. Those journeys all begin with acknowledging that you have implicit biases, and which one of your biases are presenting a barrier, which one of your biases are helping to maintain the status quo, and which one of those biases you start to dismantle and change. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And Because I was on full screen, I was not able to see the chat. So I apologize for that. But if there are any questions, I know we're close to the end.
Adriane,
Yes.
this is Mike Small from NCI. For one thing, I want to thank you, and I think I speak for a lot of the people that were in the chat on, how timely this topic is and how important it is. I did want to. I felt obligated to point out one thing that you may or may not be aware of is that NIH has a very robust effort to, that is trying to address these issues. By no means is this a simple problem, but there is a program called Unite, which is underway at the NIH level, which believe me, is being taken very seriously. And there's a parallel effort at the National Cancer Institute, which I'm part of, which is really trying not only to address this issue at NCI in the workplace, but also to reach out to the academic institutions that we serve.